affected the skill immigration may be largely an empirical matter, but to ask about possible scenarios in the aftermath of COVID-19, it's indeed a matter of speculation. So this speculation may be moving across two main concerns. First, we should think about how we believe COVID is modifying the core of our experiences and conduct, including perhaps, of course, the experiences and conduct of those highly specialized workers who seek to emigrate. Now, second, what we should do. What is required from us as a matter of public policy? Now, I hope it is not too controversial today to say that this kind of speculation may be in its own nature an interdisciplinary reflection. That is the reason that reflecting upon this kind of speculation has brought us together at the end. In this panel, some of the most remarkable specialists coming from several areas of expertise are going to show us their research around this matter. So before I give you the specialists today, let me say something about these two coordinates along which the speculation should be moving. And also how interdisciplinary reflection across them may be even possible. First, we often forget in social sciences that what makes possible to share knowledge across different disciplines and approaches around this kind of research, this kind of speculation, it's a common medium between these disciplines and approaches. This sort of common ground of reflection may be articulated by theoretical and philosophical disciplines. Now, I know what you are thinking. You are thinking perhaps that philosophers such as myself are often known for remarking the obvious. And these things that I just said may be obvious to you. But for educated guesses and speculation, it may be worth highlighting that philosophy contributes to this kind of research in two mind senses. First, it may help to develop and revise the sort of theoretical core that makes qualitative and quantitative research possible, but not only possible, but also intelligible and certain. The structure of this kind of research. For instance, structuralist, post-structuralist, and many other approaches may help us to understand how we should interpret, understand reality in order to frame problems, as much as philosophy of science also sanctions the kind of knowledge that quantitative studies should provide. Secondly, it also develops and revises the kind of theoretical approaches that determine what we should do in terms of what kind of solutions are desirable according to our core moral values, and how we compare different solutions, different possibilities in public policy in order to single out, to pick up the ones that may help us to bring about justice in our social world, and at the end, to create more orderly and more sustainable, skilled schemes of migration. Now, the first kind of contribution is particularly important if we require a sort of phenomenology of worldwide events such as the pandemic, and how it has meaningfully changed human experience, including, of course, that experience of the highly specialized workers looking to migrate, that we are concerned today. Phenomenology is this kind of account of phenomena that happens in reality, in palpable reality, but that also happens inside us, in the way that we feel and experience and perceive things that happens to us, even collectively. And the second kind of contribution is paramount if we need to speculate about what kind of policies we may envision in order, as I said, to bring about more orderly and sustainable skilled migration. Yet, it is important to say, perhaps regrettably, that philosophical disciplines are seldom taken into account in interdisciplinary studies of this kind. A lot of people like to say that they do interdisciplinary research, but in fact, the kind of approach that glues all approaches together, approaches coming from different disciplines, are these kind of theoretical studies. So they serve as a basis for, as I said, of common discussion. And in my experience in developing countries, although they have an important role in the design of many developed countries, design of policies, they don't play an important role in the academia and the scene of public policies in developing countries. So why is this? This is very strange. Perhaps it is one of those pernicious, I should submit, those pernicious effects of post-colonial effects in higher education, where members of developing countries are merely seen as well situated to study the empirical problems that happen to them, because they are happening to them, but they are not seen as well situated as members of developed countries, which are more seen as the kind of people who should study how to change the world. So, in fact, when we reframe ourselves in using this kind of methodology and relate this kind of methodologies in social studies, we are giving up this kind of reflection about how to change the world to other countries, to members of other countries, to members of other universities. So maybe some of you can shed some light about this matter, which really confuses me. Being that as it may, the philosophical approach may offer phenomenologies and interpretations of how COVID-19 has affected the experience of skilled workers, and also, on the other side, in a parallel way, applied ethics may offer ideal policy frameworks to discuss what justice requires from public policy in the aftermath of worldwide events such as a pandemic, for the case of those skilled workers and the countries involved. Just to conclude these brief remarks, I can mention at least two examples of this. First, regarding the shifts on experience that I mentioned around phenomenological studies, we have all seen an increase in the use of technologies of information and communication. Many people that we may know, or even ourselves, that have otherwise remained oblivious or at the margins of such technologies and their use in working settings, have the need to become proficient in this kind of technologies that actually we're using today. This may mean that closest space proximity is not longer regarded as needed for work environments of some skilled workers. So many people may use these technologies in the future not only to be recruited or to actually work in other countries without even leaving their countries of origin. But also, there are a vast literature about the pernicious effects of this kind of technologies. This kind studies claim that these kind of technologies may threaten autonomy, may hinder democracy, and that these technologies have the potential to manipulate our decision-making processes and takes us as commodities to sell to big corporations in the process. Now, in the second contribution, there are several policy proposals already in the literature about how to prevent certain detrimental effects of this kind of migration. Ethicists may disagree about whether it is overall beneficial or detrimental. As you may show in your presentation, there is a vast amount of evidence in both ways. But they also disagree about the reasonable scope of freedom of movement and freedom of employment. We obviously know that no freedom or right is absolute. So we need to know the kind of limits that this kind of freedoms may have in certain conditions, such as skill immigration, and also the kind of coercion that is morally permissible when countries of origin have invested greatly in the training of these skilled workers. But almost all ethicists agree that there may be cases of net loss, cases where countries may suffer for detrimental effects of this kind of immigration, and in those cases, justice requires us to act by means of co-responsibility schemes, such as compulsory service programs. These kind of programs where professionals and skilled workers are either forced to remain in the country of origin, or taxation programs. Many kind of taxation programs, departure taxes, ongoing taxation on income, or tax sharing programs. These kind of programs may have the need for developing international institutions that don't exist yet. Now, I'm gonna let everyone to share their views about this kind of subjects. Today we have the honor of listening to Laura Vasquez. I'm not going to spend much time saying things about the CVs of the people that we have today. All of them have brilliant careers. You are all welcome to look for them in Google, and you will find a lot of information about what they do. So I'm going to only mention the people that we have today, and we are blessed to have today. We are going to begin with Laura Vasquez from National Autonomous University of Mexico. Then we will have Didar Singh, former Secretary of the Government of India. Then we will have Camelia Chigo from National University of Mexico as well. Next, we will listen to Rupa Chanda from the Indian Institute of Management at Bangalore. Then we will be hearing Andres Solimano, which is now former in Oxford University and now at Santiago. And then at the end, we will listen to Wei Li from Arizona State University. Just for remembering the process of these kind of talks, every speaker will have up to 7 minutes for their presentation. After that, I will be forced to interrupt them in the first round, and then we will have a second round that maybe we can devote to policy remarks. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very grateful for being here today. So let's begin, please, with Laura Vázquez.
Thank you for this introduction, very interesting introduction, Enrique. I would like to thank my colleague Camelia Tigao from CISAN-UNAM for this invite to participate in this webinar on skilled migration and COVID. It is a pleasure to collaborate in this forum and share with you some ideas. In this brief I thought it was 7 to 10 minutes, but I'll keep it down to 7-minute intervention on my part. I would like to share thoughts on 2 issues related to skilled migration and COVID. Firstly, I'd like to speak about the management of the COVID crisis by Australia, a country in which skilled migration has played an important role since the last decades of the 20th century. And secondly, the case of international students, their weight on Australian universities and the COVID impact on this sector. So on the first point, before entering on the Australian responses to managing the COVID crisis, which I will keep for the policy discussion part, I would like to firstly and very briefly make a quick introduction to the topic of skilled migration in Australia and its importance, particularly since the 1980s. The number of permanent skilled migrants arriving yearly in Australia has increased dramatically, from 10,000 in the mid-1980s to 120,000 yearly in the past 5 years. During 2018 in Australia, there was an arrival of 112,000 skilled migrants. A high proportion of Latin American migrants from countries such as Mexico have migrated on this stream. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, among the foreign-born migrants currently residing in Australia, around 136,000 come from Latin American countries. And of these, nearly 5,000 were born in Mexico. The vast majority of Mexican migrants are highly skilled in Australia. As you all know, you probably know, not the majority of Mexican migrants are highly skilled. 65% of Mexican-born migrants have a bachelor degree level of education or above in Australia, as compared to 20% of those born in Australia and 32% born overseas. So with regards to the Mexican population in Australia, we're talking about one of the most highly skilled cohorts in the country. Australia and the rest of the world, as we all know, have entered curious times facing the threat of COVID-19. In recent weeks, many countries around the world, including Australia, have imposed travel restrictions to help curb the spread of the coronavirus. Airport closures, restrictions, suspension of all incoming and outgoing flights, nationwide lockdowns, enforced quarantine, and are just some of the measures countries are adopting in an effort to contain the pandemic. So in today's world, where we have 272 million international migrants, many will have difficulties returning to their home countries in the near future due to the increasing travel restrictions and fewer commercial airline flights. And obviously, this affects both skilled and less skilled migrants. The Australian government has imposed a travel ban on non-permanent residents and non-citizens entering Australia. This means that if someone holds a temporary visa, he or she cannot travel to Australia. That means the ban includes people who are outside Australia and hold a student visa, graduate visas, provisional skilled visas, and other temporary visas. I will delve into the case of student visa holders in the second point. Individuals who are in Australia and hold a temporary visa, the ban does not affect them nor does it prevent them from departing from Australia. It does not affect them in the sense that they do not have to leave the country. Now, in terms of the financial support provided by the Australian government, and this is an important point in terms of policy, in addition to the strong control and sanitation measures implemented by the Australian government to deal with the COVID pandemic, Australia has been characterized by the great financial support provided to its citizens and permanent residents, many of these being highly skilled migrants. An Australian colleague of mine wrote to me back in April and said huge amount of money have been allocated to support people thrown out of work. Australia has been able to provide enormous tax support to both individuals and businesses experiencing economic difficulties. The Australian government economic response has been focused primarily on supporting companies in managing short-term cash flows, ensuring that employers can keep their employees during this difficult period. And there's several measures. I won't get into the details of them, but these cash flows supporting Australian companies have helped for companies to keep their employees, which are both on all kinds of visas and migration statuses. Initially, the government announced many of these measures would last for 6 months, but in the last month, they announced that they will keep them until March 2021. So they are already expecting these as all around the world, that this will continue. The problems with the COVID and the economic consequences will continue for a long time. So just to sum up with regards to this first point, I'd like to highlight that Australia, an important destination for high-skilled migration, is one of the countries around the world with some of the highest COVID mobility restrictions. Many of these high-skilled migrants are citizens and permanent residents, but they are citizens or permanent residents, but a significant number are on high-skilled temporary visas in vulnerable situations, and in many cases, not eligible for financial support. Skilled migrants in Australia, although not restricted to leave Australia, are virtually stranded indefinitely in the country, given their countries of origins, poor management of the pandemic, and they are left struggling with the significant impacts on their capacity to respond to their family and other transnational commitments by not being able to go back to their countries. Now, the other issue I would like to touch upon is the case of international students and their relative importance on Australian universities during and post-COVID. One of the types of skilled migration hardly hit by the COVID crisis is the case of international students. As countries imposed ban on travel, thousands of students have become stranded and have seen their academic plans interrupted without a foreseeable solution. The 4 main English language competitors of international students, namely the USA, UK, Canada, and Australia, have all imposed travel restrictions, and many universities have implemented changes to teaching, including a shift from face-to-face learning to online education. This has had a significant impact on international students. Australian universities are suffering revenue and job losses due to the current and projected loss of international students. It is estimated that the sector may lose up to 19 billion Australian dollars in the next 3 years, and more than 20,000 jobs are at risk over the next 6 months. So it is not an exaggeration to assert that without international students, Australian universities will downsize and some might collapse altogether. From 2003 to 2018, international onshore student revenue rose on average as a share of all universities' revenue from 14% to 26%. So for some universities, the dependency is even greater, well exceeding 30%. In July, just last month, the Australian government announced visa changes to ensure international students are not worse off due to the coronavirus pandemic. and that Australia remains competitive with other countries. This is a very important issue for the government to remain competitive, as international students are such an important income, a part of the Australian economy. I'll keep, if you're interested, for the discussion part, some of those changes that the Australian government announced for the case of international students. So just basically to highlight some of the points I just raised in terms of international students, they're one type of high-skilled migrants strongly affected by the COVID crisis. Their situation is particularly vulnerable as they are not eligible to the government's financial support schemes. And in many cases, them and their families have had they have made enormous investments into their international academic experience. Students who commenced their studies prior to COVID have to make the hard decision to either stay in the destination country, in this case, Australia, with no face-to-face learning, maintaining the burden of all the costs of being in the foreign country in isolation, or returning to their country with an indefinitely interrupted academic plan for their tertiary education. For those students who were to commence their studies right at the inception of the pandemic and afterwards, have had to put on hold their plans for international study. So I'll leave it to that, and I'm looking forward to hearing the thoughts of my colleagues and participating in the discussion part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this very informative account. I have to mention that we have Ambassador Naida Chauvin with us today. We also have Graciela Martinez Salce, Director of CISAN, Professor Vinod Kadria, and Professor Silvia Núñez with us. I may engage with them in a bit in order to ask them about their remarks about these talks that we are having today. Now, we are going to listen Didar Singh. You all know him, former Secretary of the Government of India. Please, Dr. Singh, could you please begin?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Enrique. I hope you can all hear me. I'm a former bureaucrat, so I'm going to be very crisp, and I'm going to limit myself to the 7 minutes you've allotted and make 5 basic points. Point number 1, what is high-skilled migration? High-skilled migration is debated around the world, and there are different criteria for measuring high skills. Some countries follow wage criteria, some countries follow skills criteria. But basically, to make it simple for all of us to understand, I'm going to limit myself to saying that high-skilled migration is professionals, whereas low-skilled migration is labor. This is the distinction. It's a very rough distinction, but this is the distinction that I'm going to make. Point number 2. There are many positives and there are many negatives so far as sending and receiving countries are concerned. This refers to both high-skilled and low-skilled migration. It refers to all migration. For sending countries, the biggest issue is brain drain. The second issue is that this could raise skilling within the country itself so that high-skilled migrants can travel better and go better. Third aspect is remittances increase. And fourth aspect is that all countries promote or try to promote some amount of circulation in the migration, particularly of high-skilled migrants. So far as receiving countries are concerned, the funny thing is that there is in this pandemic and now developing around the world something which has been there for a long time, which is there is an anti-feeling against all migrants. There is a feeling developing and a fear developing both for low-skilled migrants and high-skilled migrants that they take away jobs. The second more dangerous thing so far as receiving countries are concerned is there is talking of stealing of technology. They say particularly high-skilled migrants steal technology. Students and professors steal technology. This has become a big issue in the USA-China debate, which we are all aware of. In case of receiving countries, there's also a greater emphasis on R&D and knowledge sharing, and skills migration therefore begins to have an impact both on sending countries as well as receiving countries. The important point for us to understand out here is that it's actually the professionals that, if at all, will impact the jobs of the receiving countries and not really the low skilled labor migrants. And yet it's the other way around. There is a greater antipathy. More countries try to make rules to encourage high skilled migrants and reduce low skilled migrants from coming into their country. This is a very odd thing that you notice across the world so far as policy is concerned. Item number 3. So far as pandemic is concerned, we know that what it is doing is it is speeding up change which is already happening. It's nothing very new, but it has led to a great feeling of a tremendous antipathy and fear against anything that migration represents. This is leading to a tremendously new program and a new problem that has occurred across many countries, including my own, which is return migration. We are now beginning to see a very large amount of return migration happening of workers, of laborers, of professionals, and they have to be accommodated in the economy that they return to. And this, of course, is also impacting remittances, which are now beginning to reduce. But as Professor Enrique informed also a little earlier, technology usage is increasing and we'll see more and more of this. Fourth point, Asia. We are talking today of Latin America and Asia. So far as Asia is concerned, I'll make a very rough kind of statement out here of what is high skilled migrants. I would roughly divide that in the 100% of migrants that go from Asia, and 1/3 of all migrants around the world are actually from Asia, I would say 70% are low skilled and 30% are high skilled. It's a very rough calculation, but it would apply to Philippines, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, even China to some amount. Now, this is a very rough estimation, but it's giving you an idea of what we are talking about. And fifthly, the last point that I'm going to be making is what is the future of high skilled migration. So far as future is concerned, let us understand that with the pandemic and the way the whole migration debate is now happening around the world, you're going to see more and more of localization and less of globalization. This will have an impact on business. It will have an impact on the very functioning of individual countries, but it is something that we have to build into our future policy making. The next point about the future is, as Professor Enrique himself was also mentioning, technology will play a greater role. Already right now we are in the Zoom conference. This is all about technology, and we'll see more and more of this technology being used, and particularly for migration, the use of technology for information, whether you are going for migration or you are returning for migration, information and knowledge will play a greater role in it. Finally, we are talking about managing migration, which is what this whole debate is all about. All countries around the world, whether you're Canada, Australia, USA, UK, whatever the receiving countries, they want to manage migration. Now, to manage migration and to make correct policies on migration, the single most important thing that you need to have is that of the voice of the migrants themselves. Nowhere in our policy making do we implement aspects to encourage the voice of the migrants. At least so far as high skilled migration is concerned, definitely the voice of the migrants can be brought in and can be really seen, particularly in all the receiving countries. And that's the last point I'll leave you with. How do we encourage more of research, more of papers, more of work, more of articles to say that the voice of the migrants must get heard? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh, for this very clever and very informative account. I should also remind you all that, as it is the case in this series of talks, my colleagues and I myself are monitoring the chat box. So please feel free to pose questions to the speakers in the chat box. And some of these questions should be taken later on in the webinar. I also thank Dr. Singh for making reference to other speakers. This is very welcome in order to keep the flow of the discussion. So now I welcome Camelia Chicao from National University of Mexico to the floor. Thank you very much, Camelia. We don't have Camelia?
Professor, you are...
Yes. Okay, sorry. So thank you so much for inviting CSUN, the Center for Research on North America, to organize these sessions. And the idea is to have 3 sessions on Latin America and India to compare the perspectives of Asia and Latin America. And we are very happy to have scholars here, such as Andres Solimano and Laura, and we're going to have more sessions like this. Now I'm going to talk about a particular case that happened here in Mexico about the medical personnel during the COVID pandemics. And I'm going to talk about some Cuban doctors that were invited to work in Mexico during the pandemics. As you know, medicine is one of the main occupations of skilled migrants in the US. There are about 10,000 licensed doctors of Mexican origin in the US, according to the census. Already previous to the current pandemics, there was the discussion in Mexico about the understaffing of Mexican hospitals due to migration and underemployment of specialists. But of course, it is in times of crisis, such as the present pandemics, that the scarcity of good quality healthcare pays. So this discussion has been more recurrent since March 2020, and especially because of a particular governmental agreement between Mexico and Cuba to bring in Cuban doctors to help along the crisis. So the Mexican government paid Cuba $6.2 million for the temporary services of 585 doctors during the second trimester of 2020. And the agreement involved not only direct care, but also advice, field work, epidemiological work, and a part of protocol analysis, which includes, in addition to doctors and nurses, biomedical engineers and epidemiologists. Now, did this happen the way it was planned? That's what I'm going to talk about today. This arrival has faced 2 main critiques. One that is directed to the conditions under which these people were hired, and the other associated to what some may call the discrimination against foreign workers in Mexico. The first one is the human rights of Cuban medical doctors. During the pandemics, Cuba has sent its health workers to around 70 countries as a way to increase incomes. According to Reuters, Havana kept 80% of what it charged for its doctor, at least to the ones previously sent to Brazil. According to UN sources, the working conditions of these Cuban doctors could be categorized as forced labor, a modern form of slavery. Now, this year, after the deployment of several contingents of Cuban doctors to at least 23 countries, amid the coronavirus pandemics, the US State Department attacked the program for its unfair conditions. Havana insisted that its army in white coats, which has battled cholera in Haiti and Ebola in West Africa, is one of the pillars of the revolution established by late Fidel Castro and called Palmer and Slender on the declaration of the State Department. In response to these critiques, the Mexican authorities maintained that this was voluntary work and that carpe diem of Cuban doctors was paid by private donors. A second type of critique to the arrival of Cuban doctors came from the Mexican doctors themselves and has been also interpreted as discrimination against foreign workers, as I said. Mexican doctors complained that their Cuban colleagues were better paid and not really complying with the work that they were hired for. They were just taking the blood pressure and body temperature of the patients, some said. Cuban doctors are not prepared to put out fires of the coronavirus in Mexico, even when they receive higher payment, according to Mexican doctors. Now, of course, in turn, Mexican doctors were criticized for discriminating their Cuban colleagues. However, not all the salary goes to the Cuban doctors, as I previously noted. Some of the doctors have publicly confessed that they voluntarily joined the program because they receive a salary much higher than the $80 a month that they can earn in Cuba. Cuba, where health is free and universal, is one of the nations with the most doctors per capita in the world. Cuba has 8.4 physicians by 1,000 inhabitants compared to 2.4 in Mexico and 2.6 in the United States. Now I'm going to end my talk with two ideas for discussion. One is this focus on issues such as the discrimination of Cuban doctors who actually returned to Cuba in July 2020 that may distract from more serious problems of the political approach to fight the virus. Mexico, like other Latin American countries, has left lockdown early. Its number of cases is quite high, and we already have close to 50,000 deaths. Very few predictive measures were taken, not only speaking of healthcare preparation, but also to estimate the number of cases. For instance, there is a model by Sirkechi and Yusa Shahin. They have proposed a model of migration and travel intensity that could explain the outbreak of the spread of COVID-19 since it appeared at the end of 2019. Based on this model, a country such as Mexico, with a constant flow and the culture of outmigration to the United States, could have been better prepared and taken early measures to contain the spread of the virus. And the second idea, and this is very short, Mexico is following a broader trend of the overall medical migration during COVID. Preference is given to health workers over other types of workers to deal with the pandemics. And this is true for the case of Mexico, but also for other countries such as the US. Maybe I will turn back to the idea in the final round if there is time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Camelia. We now proceed to welcome Professor Rupa Chanda from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Please all welcome Professor Chanda.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. So I've been asked to speak about skilled Indian migration to developed countries. And the perspective I'm coming from is more from the trade and economic cooperation side. So if one just starts by looking at the kind of migration from India to the rest of the world and the distribution of that migration, we know that it's quite a large migrant stock that we have. It's increased threefold between 1990 and 2019. So 17.5 million is the estimate from the United Nations. And there are several important destination countries. The Middle East and Gulf, of course, are very important. But then you have the English-speaking OECD countries, UK, US, Canada, Australia, etc. Now, the significance of skilled migration within this is worth noting. For instance, if you take the H-1B visa admissions by early 2000s, 60% of the 100,000 Indian-born people in the US had come through the H-1B program. Mostly were in the IT-related professions. About 500,000 H-1B visas issued between 2004 and 2012 went to Indians. If you look at the main source country for foreign doctors for the OECD countries, it's India. We are second in terms of nurses. In Canada, we are the biggest users of the International Mobility Program and the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. So basically, if you look across various countries, you'll find the significant proportion of Indians in the skilled immigration schemes. Of course, in recent years, there have been a lot of issues regarding this. We have a dispute going on with the United States regarding the hike in visa fees and two of their non-immigrant temporary working visa measures that they have put in and their inconsistency with their WTO obligations. There's also been problems with the United Kingdom because of the removal of the post-study work program, and that led to a decline in the number of students. Again, if we look at educational attainment rates and the kinds of professions, basically the significance of skilled migration comes through very, very clearly. Compared to the local population, if you take the Migration Policy Institute sort of numbers, the proportion of Indians who have bachelor's degrees or master's degrees is much greater than that of the local population. And the preponderance is also there in things like management, professional, and related occupations. So obviously that it's clear that skilled migration is important. And also, if you look at remittances, even though the bulk of our remittances do come from the Gulf countries, but the OECD countries constitute around a third, around 34% of the total remittances into India. Now, coming to the post-COVID or COVID-related challenges, already I would say that, it basically aggravates the restrictiveness that was all on the rise in the last few years. So border policies have become more restrictive. And now, especially in the United States, with rising unemployment, the upcoming elections, it's just aggravated matters. And COVID has added, it's like another whammy into this. And if I just quote certain things that have been said in the US media, for instance, the suspension of the immigration scheme, the optional practical training program, which was very useful for international students to stay on 1 year and work in their stream. For STEM professions, they could work up to 3 years. So this was a great way. It's like a post-study work program, basically. And a lot of this is really going to affect students from around the world. And what they've said is the first and most important thing is to turn off the faucet of new immigrant labor. Mission accomplished. So when they suspended the program. So this is the kind of rhetoric that we are hearing. Now, how will this affect India in particular? Well, clearly the suspension of the H-1B program will majorly affect, because Indians are the biggest users of the H-1B scheme. So the cost of getting an H-1B visa will definitely rise for Indian companies. It will lead to some shift towards local hiring. Those who are already sponsored by the employers and are already through the labor certification process but happen to be overseas, whether they'll be able to go or not, it's not clear. There'll be an effect on family immigration. And the long-term consequences, it's possible that in the future, these visas could be restricted to very highly paid skilled foreign workers, and maybe the mid-level and low-cost back office type of services would be screened out. A lot of it will become virtual. So we might see some realignment within the professions in terms of what sort of skill sets are targeted. So probably it'll become much, much more restrictive towards the high-end skills. And with increased remote work, we also expect less dependence on visas, especially the long-term visas like the H-1B. The other thing, which was alluded to by my previous speaker, is the rethink, the kind of focus we are seeing on health workers. Because within all of this, we are finding in the US and the UK, for instance, that there is clearly a preference now being given to certain sectors and occupations, and the health sector is the one that's getting the preference. So in the US, despite all of this that's going on with the ban on H-1Bs, there is an exemption for medical and other essential workers. So health workers and investor program applicants, so again, people who want to invest in the US, these have been exempted from the green card suspension. And it's been recommended that the unused immigrant visas would be used for professional nurses and physicians. Similarly, in the UK also, a parliamentary panel has called on the government to offer British citizenship or permanent residency to all foreign healthcare workers. So it's a fee-free 1-year visa extension for all NHS staff and social care workers, regardless of job, role, pay, visa route. And they've also scrapped the immigration health surcharge, which is levied on non-EU doctors, nurses, care workers, etc. So we can see that, again, not only is there a tilt within the professions, probably towards more high skilled, but also across professions. And clearly, because of the pandemic, the healthcare capacity issue is so burning now that all countries which are revamping their immigration schemes will give a clear preference towards the healthcare sector. Now, very briefly, how do we face these protectionist challenges? Are there new opportunities in a post-COVID world? And how can we sort of use other mechanisms? So what's interesting is the other talk that was going on by Shashi Tharoor. I don't know if others were listening to that or not. The question posed to him was, can we use bilateral agreements? Can we use other forums to somehow push the agenda of better managed migration? And this is actually what I wanted to speak on, that possible approaches to keep the high-skilled migration flowing, but in a better managed way, while economic engagement through broad or sector-specific bilateral agreements or pacts is probably one thing we have to consider. I know this is not a great time with growing protectionism and trade wars, etc. But still, if we take a still longer term perspective, because of the thrust that is happening on relocation of investments, new geopolitical alliances that are going to be created in a post-COVID world, to a large extent, I think one can use that momentum and try to push forward in the long term more of broad-based economic cooperation and partnership agreements. Now, why do I talk about this? From the Indian perspective, it's important because there is some discussion about a US-India limited trade deal. It will be very difficult to put forward, but still, it is there. There's Brexit, and the UK is looking at new partners, and India is potentially one of them. There's India-EU broad-based trade and investment agreement, and then there are ongoing reviews of other agreements we have with many Asian partners. So therefore, I think there are these alternate forums where mobility is already on the agenda. How we push it in a post-COVID world is what we have to look at. So I have some ideas. Maybe I can come back to this. I think in a US-India trade deal, one of the things to really look at is investment-linked mobility schemes, because US companies are looking for new investment partners. India is looking at shifting and bringing in investment from other countries, especially from China, into India. So can we seize this opportunity and try to negotiate something? Startup visas, innovator visas. So there are some ideas I think we have to think about. In a post-Brexit sort of scenario with the UK, well, the UK has come up with a new points-based system. It has made things more flexible. It's brought in the post-study work visa. There are new categories of visas, like for startups and global talent visa. Again, is there an opportunity here for India to tap into or have some sort of fast tracking for limited categories? I think health is one area, again, where bilaterally there is interest. India already has some agreements with the European countries. Again, can we facilitate that movement in a more mutually beneficial manner? In our reviews of other agreements, mobility sector, occupational lists have been created. Again, we need to have more dialogue on those issues. So apart from the agreements, I think the other thing to really tap into is the diaspora. We do have a large skilled diaspora stock in many of these countries, and the soft power of these countries is important. So the pro-business, pro-trade, pro-investment sort of lobbying that some of your skilled diaspora can do, that is something I think we need to leverage. So I'll just leave with these thoughts, and we can take it forward in the discussion on policies and way forward.
Thank you very much, Professor Chanda. I think you leave us with many, many questions. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Now I welcome Professor Andrés Solimano. Please, Professor, could you please begin?
Yes. Hi. I am in. Hello? Are you?
Yes, sir,
yes,
we can hear. We can hear, sir.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Perfectly.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Enrique, for the presentation, and it's a great webinar, how we say these days. And also, I would like to thank you, Camelia Tigao, Professor Tigao, for the kind invitation to join this webinar. Well, I have 7 minutes, so I will have to go straight to the points that I wanted to make. Basically, I will focus my presentation on the impact of the global economic contraction that takes place with the COVID crisis, and basically with the COVID contention policies like restrictions to mobility, lockdowns, etc., on migration flows, particularly high-skill migrations. I have some other points to make also on the role of technology, telepresence, some thoughts on international mobility of entrepreneurs, investors, millionaires, etc. But I will focus, perhaps in the question and answer section of the webinar, I may take up those points, but I will mainly focus on the economic impact as I see it from the COVID crisis. Well, first, according to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the global economy, the world economy, should contract between 5.5–6% this year. These estimates, these forecasts are being revised upwards, unfortunately. But we are in the presence of a big economic contraction, probably the most serious since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And this global economic contraction is affecting more the economies of the global north. The US is expected to contract GDP by around 7%. Countries like Germany, France, Italy, the UK, the numbers not only from the IMF, from the OECD, the World Bank, the European Commission, etc., are between 8 to 10, 11%. We just heard last week the numbers for the contraction of the second quarter of 2020 in Europe, an average of minus 12%, etc., minus 9.5% in the US, etc. It's a big contraction. But this COVID crisis is hitting less in the aggregate the developing countries, let's say the global south. And this is due mainly because China and India are keeping positive growth. The growth rates below the rate of growth of the previous years, but still positive growth. So while the global north, Canada, the US, Europe, etc., is expected to be contracting by -8 on average, the developing world may be contracting by -2, -3%. This matters a lot because migration flows are typically from the south to the north. And this applies also to the migration of high-skilled people. So there is, of course, some deal of south-south migration. Laura spoke about migration to Australia. Australia is geographically in the global south, but economically is in the global north, I would say. So there are some distinctions that need to be made in this analysis. But basically, the fact that the main destination areas of the world economy are shrinking so fast and deep is going to affect quite sharply these flows. Well, this is what the aggregate analysis, the macroeconomic analysis would say. But if one makes a distinction among economic sectors, and perhaps we can here identify high exposure sectors like tourism, traveling, live entertainment, retail trade, which are the sectors more exposed to the shocks of the COVID crisis, then we see those sectors are going to be hit hard. But the demand for high-skilled migrant, except in the live entertainment, perhaps, I don't know, in air traveling, but it's not that high. Then there is a second sector, which one could label as resilient or low exposure, which, I don't know, includes industry and other activities, which is unclear the direction in terms of content of high-skilled migrants. And then there is a third sector, which I would put as sectors with upside potential, even within this big economic contraction. Here is high-tech, medical services, the internet and communication platforms, e-commerce, e-education. These sectors are very intensive in the demand for high-skilled migrants. So this is a good news, potentially good news for high-skilled migrant mobility and the demand for this type of migration flows. Even in the midst of the economic contraction, Amazon has increased its hirings of people and is approaching 1 million employees. Okay, so Amazon is not contracting, it's expanding. In spite that the overall American economy is contracting, there are near 35 million unemployed people now. Sharp increase from the numbers of January, February, and the numbers of last year. But still, companies like Amazon is expanding. Also, some commercial companies that offer e-education and e-training are hiring people. Sweden, going to Europe, the Swedish health sector is very reliant these days on foreign-born medical doctors and nurses. The numbers tell that near 35% of the total medical doctors are from foreign origin in Sweden. And Sweden is a country that has been hit hard by the pandemic. They chose a particular way to respond it. They have avoided the lockdowns. But so it's a concrete example that they're relying on foreign migrants. The US and the UK, it has been made by previous speakers, also in Canada, all employ significant numbers of foreign-born health personnel. So this is, my point is that this is a mixed story. We have an overall economic contraction. We have a very serious depression, economic recession or depression. I think it qualifies better as depression in many countries. But at the same time, there are opportunities. I think this is a very important point. Now, on the side of the origin countries, we were asked to make some remarks on Latin America and Asia. Well, the problem is that not only in the case of Latin America, not only destination areas are shrinking, but also the economies of the origin countries. According to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations, the Latin American economy may contract this year, 2020, by a number around 9 to 10%. So there is a pushing factor for migrants, and this, to some extent, will affect also high-skilled migrants. So we have a complicated situation. We have the destination areas shrinking. We have the origin economies also contracting. There is nowhere very clearly to go. This is the story in Latin America. For what I see in Asia, and the colleagues here probably have a better and closer knowledge of that geographical area, we have the situation is probably less dramatic. East Asia, at least. China is recovering, Korea, Hong Kong, they have their own more geopolitical problems. Singapore, Vietnam, they are not doing bad now with this crisis. India is keeping positive growth. So the story is different from Latin America. So my point is basically we don't have a black and white or yes or no answer on the impact of this crisis on the flows of high-skilled migrants. I have other points. I agree that physical migration may be affected by the use of devices like we are using now, Zoom, Google Meet, StreamYard, and others. So there is a substitution that we may envisage between physical presence of the high-skilled migrant and indirect telepresence. But this may affect, this is an important topic for research and analysis, the shape of the future flows. Well, finally, just one point. I think there will be a geographical reconfiguration of the destination of the migrant flows. The US is in serious trouble. They have a political crisis, a fluid political situation with an upcoming presidential election. The date may be even postponed. In the last 2 months, they have been experiencing social unrest. They have the labor market virtually has collapsed. A jump from 5 to 6 million unemployed people to 35 million in 3-4 months. That was even unheard, even in the Great Depression. And so it's the country that was the global magnet for migrants is experiencing a serious crisis. So this opened the door for further reflection. So the UK also, Anglo-Saxon countries, the UK under Boris Johnson has been also been hit hard with the COVID crisis. So and the global South, and particularly the East, is not doing bad. So this may affect the configuration of flows. I stop here. I think perhaps I overstepped my 7 minutes allocation. Thank you, Enrique.
Thank you very much, Luis Enrique, for giving me the floor. And I would like to also thank GRFDT for inviting me to participate. I have been listening to quite very informative and a lot of issues from the panelists. Thanks to all the panelists, a lot of points that they have made quite energizing our brain. And I'm very glad to see that the international students are included in the discussion of high-skilled migration. I think that is a very important point. We most of the time miss out when we talk about international migration in any platform or any forum. So I'm really very glad to see that to be included. I would like to mention 2 points. Firstly, about the issue of brain drain. Now, in terms of high skill migration, international students, migrants, I do not see it as a brain drain. Rather, I always see it as a brain gain. And if you look at the top countries where international students originate from, mainly like mostly, yes, in Asia, from Asia, like China, India, and Republic of Korea. And if you look at the pace of the development and the growth rate in these countries, I don't think that it indicates towards any brain drain, but rather a lot of international students always contribute back to the countries of their origin. Sometimes they go back, and sometimes staying even with the diaspora, they always contribute. At least from Bangladesh side, we have seen it, and I'm sure that there are a lot of such contribution going back to the countries of origin, both in China, India, and other countries as well. How we channelize and what actions we take to profit and make it a real, very sustainable brain gain is something that needs to be seen, both in the countries of destination as well as in the countries of origin. 2 sides of actions. One, in the countries of origin, we need to look at the policies, the actions, the initiatives that needs to be taken in creating opportunities for the use of that knowledge gain more substantive, more sustainable. And also in the destination country, there is a huge potentiality of the international students to make use of the skill that they get, and also the skill that they have brought in from their countries of origins. So that needs to be seen through the policy making and also through the initiatives and the actions. Now, going back to a little bit on Bangladesh, the UNESCO report shows that in 2017, there were about 60,000 students going out of Bangladesh to various countries, which has increased in last 3 years. And the demographic projection, as we see now, is that by 2025, the middle income sector of the country, which we call the middle class, will be increasing in triples. So that will create, I think, another huge focus or generate more international students coming out of Bangladesh. Now, I see that the COVID has imposed a huge challenge on the total scenario, firstly on economy, which Andrew Soliman, professor, has already mentioned. And I'm very glad, because the whole challenge that comes out from COVID to the migration scenario needs to be seen in an economic condition comprehensively. I'll be shortening my points. As Laura has said that
we are already out of time.
I'll take 30 seconds.
I'm so sorry.
Just 30 seconds. The students are hit hard financially and also in terms of their visa, but there are some good initiatives as well. But when we look at the localization, what we need to see is to understand by the policymakers in the destination countries how actually it gives a lot of input in the GDP of the countries of origin, countries of destination, because international students are like the clients for the universities, and they give a lot of contribution to the financing of the universities as well as into the GDP. High skill migration does the same thing. And in the coming days, because of COVID as well, we will see a lot of gaps in the destination countries in terms of in the health sector in many of the developed countries, as well as in the STEM sector in many of the developed countries, which can be fulfilled by high skill migration, including international migration. Lastly, last point is actually the migrants' needs must be understood, and migration needs to be understood by the policymakers going beyond their peripheral views. That is something we need to understand, and that is something I think a platform like GRFDT needs to channelize and raise awareness in the policy making sectors in the countries of destination and origin, so that the international high skill migrants do not suffer. Because if it suffers, the countries of destination and the countries of origin will also suffer, and the migrants will also suffer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think we also could benefit from the view coming from Professor Vinod Kadria. Maybe he could comment on the on who should be taking the slack of the economic contraction.
Thank you, Professor Luis Camacho. Well, it has been a very engaging session, and I have been very much impressed, or I would say, you know, compelled to think out of the box by your long introduction, which was coming from a philosopher, gave us a completely different perspective of how to look at the changing situation. I would say it is some kind of a drastic change that the world is experiencing. It's not something which was expected. So speaking from philosophical point of view, from Asia, I'm reminded of two philosophies that originated in this part of the world: the Hindu philosophy, which is very, very old, and the Buddhist philosophy. And both of them were actually talking about globalization in the local ancient language of India or Indian subcontinent, Sanskrit. There is a term called Vasudeva Kutumbakam. The entire world is one family. And that is the essence of globalization. And I think we were heading towards this post-reforms in 1991, but there comes a shock with the COVID-19. And this is where I tend to think that, theoretically speaking, from philosophy to theory that you mentioned, we need to reflect on what is counterintuitive. And if we look at this, then this external shock of COVID-19 was something that we were not prepared for. We may have made, regression analysis, projections, this and that, taking into account uncertainties of economic uncertainty. But this is something, COVID-19 has taken the world by surprise, by a shock. And that we were not ready for. And that I think we have to recognize, we have to make a paradigm shift in our theoretical constructs, which I think we have not discussed. And in that sense, I would say, for example, we have discussed life, for example, in the Second World War, which was at stake, and we had discussed livelihood at the Great Depression, but we had not discussed the two together and the disjoint between the two of them and the contradiction between the two of them and the choice between them. Which one should come first? Should it be life or livelihood? The two are interconnected. It's a catch-22 situation. That I think we need to address with a new paradigm. I would also tend to think, Didar Singh had very rightly mentioned about, and many others have mentioned, Rupa Chanda had mentioned about remittances and so on. I think we need to again look at what is counterintuitive in that. Of course, remittances are going to go down when there will be large-scale unemployment in the world. Savings would be less, wages will be down, remittances will go down, nothing unusual about it. But what is surprising is that large amounts of remittances are coming. Why? That is coming because people are coming back, bag and baggage, and they are not keeping their capital accumulated savings in the place of destination. They want to bring everything together. And that has also reflected in some of the returned migrants that we need to take into account. So that is just as a matter of example. The time is short, I know. I'll just make one more point about methodology. And that is that we should not be discussing about high-skill migration as if high-skill migration is one omnibus category. We have to deconstruct it. And I think a lot of speakers have mentioned this already about addressing the issues of healthcare workers. Healthcare workers have suddenly become a different category. And say within healthcare, doctors and nurses, and then you have a whole range of healthcare workers down to the senators who are in high demand. We have already have examples of in the first 2 months of the COVID itself, 8,600 doctors leaving Egypt for United States of America. When the bans came on the visas, then these were exempted. You know, these categories have already been mentioned. These are the regions that we cannot take high skill migration as an omnibus category. We cannot say this is high skill, this is low skill. I think within low skill also, we need to categorize them and look at them, how the migration pattern is going to change. That I think is absolutely important. And finally, what is important is the long run and the short run. The time horizon we have to address. We cannot put everything into the basket of that this is going to happen, that is going to happen. Tomorrow, the next generation is going to ask us, yes, it is going to happen, but when? Is it going to happen tomorrow or the day after or the next year or 10 years later? And that is where I'm not worried about what demand would be for high-skilled migrants of doctors or nurses tomorrow, but how it is going to affect the tomorrow's generation, young generation, the students' decisions in terms of what to choose, whether to become a fullest economist like myself or to become somebody in high demand as a doctor or a nurse. I think that is going to be very, very crucial for all the countries in this, particularly in the global south. That I think we need
Dear
to
Professor, thank you very much. I found that very interesting, obviously. Maybe we could give the floor to Professor Silvia Núñez. Could you please comment to us your intake of the talk? You are mute. I think you should open your mic, Silvia.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Could you please be brief?
I will be very, very brief because I'm a sort of an alien. I'm not an expert in high-skill migration. But what I realize is that quite many of the speakers have experienced themselves being expats. That is so meaningful because most of the discussion, for my perspective, was kind of a elitist, talking about remittances and on the highly skilled and the future for the highly skilled. So my comment is very similar to what Professor Kadria said. I believe that it is the right time not to see the big picture and the differences between the highly skilled and the labor migration, but what is the commitment that high skilled migration needs to assume in current times. For example, in Latin America, I wish in the exposition, any of them mentioned, for example, the case of Sicosur. Sicosur is an interesting agreement between subnational areas in South America. It's quite a large region that when this idea was being built, it does incorporate educational mobility, academic mobility, expecting that the human capital of the region will start emerging as a whole. But I have not heard anyone that is analyzing how is this. I know it's not working properly, but is there any opportunities for such smaller agreements to start functioning in a better way? People do not have to move a long way from Bolivia to Argentina and from Chile to to Uruguay. And I think we are in great need to talk about at a different level, especially because I have seen that we need to focus right now on how to prevent all these people, human mobility that are suffering, and we need to start rethinking what can we do for them, not to expect what the world can still be doing for the highly skilled. I think this is exactly what we should start discussing and focusing on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia. We have only a little bit of time for wrapping up the discussion, so I should ask you only to take 1 minute in order to wrap it up and maybe say something a little bit about possible policy framework to create more orderly and sustainable skill immigration. Maybe we should begin from the bottom top with